Hello. We're back, and we are reading from The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap by Mercer Baradaran. And it's an excellent book. I'm sure some of you have heard of it before. Very important book, so of course I want to deal with it on my platform. You can see it in many places. YouTube, I'm sure you can hear about it in many places, and podcast world. But it should be in many places and more places to come. Let's get into it. Almost before the decade was over, a rewriting of the history and purpose of the civil rights movement had already begun. Dr. Martin Luther King's modern legacy had been boiled down to his historic I Have a Dream speech. More accurately, his dream was reduced to just a few sentences of that pivotal 1963 speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. In its distilled form, King's dream was interpreted as a colorblind utopia, the liberal ideal of individual equality. This is unfortunate because in the same speech there was a forceful indignation in the face of past injustice. He was asking the nation for redress for past wrongs, specifically in economic terms. So here's what some more of the speech is that you probably never hear, or some of you might have went and looked and actually noticed. So let's get into what Martin Luther King says. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise to all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. Insofar as her citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check. A check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. You see, here's the important thing. When someone does something to you or wrongs you, and then comes to you and say, well, that was in the past, what are we going to do going forward? Watch yourself with that person. When you do something wrong and someone does something wrong with you, they have to atone for it if they want to be in a relationship with you. If not, they can just keep going. But if they come back to you and just say sorry and don't make amends in some way, then they're not serious. And you know what I say about serious people. You can't really do much with them. Hi, bye, be cordial, be nice. And I'm too old now. I'm not even doing picnics or events or anything. Even if I got to be by myself until I die the rest of the way, which probably won't be long the way my body's breaking down, I just rather be with serious people. That doesn't mean I can't have fun, but still I want to be around people that I know are serious. And I have a handful of people that are like that. And that's enough for me. King, who chose his words carefully, was asking for a financial reckoning. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, King was genuinely and passionately committed to nonviolent protest. But like Gandhi, he was aware of systemic economic exploitation. He was as committed to changing structures and systems as he was to changing hearts and minds. That's very important. Segregation was not wrong because it judged people by the color of their skin, but because it was exploitative. King believed that the underlying purpose of segregation was to oppress and exploit the segregated, not simply to keep them apart. The basic purpose of segregation was to perpetuate injustice and equality. King knew, which before I go on reading, um, one of the things that was on my mind before 2020 happened, because I could see this racial thing is not going to be fixed. Um, but we got a whole great reset now that it's still not going to be fixed in people's hearts and minds like they're talking about, but structurally it's about to shift. But one of the things I used to think about was, could we go back to separate and equal as a doctrine? And politically, if the masses don't accept the Great Reset, we may end up having to do that. But right now, I think the masses are going to have to accept it. People are starting to look back and say, oh man, what did we pass up? 2020 wasn't, yes, people died. Yes, we all lost people, but structurally, housing wise, economic wise, the society was shifting. And we didn't accept the shift. We should have. Let's get back to the reading. King knew that talk of love and unity would only go so far without cold economic realism. When all is finally entered into the annals of sociology, when philosophers, politicians, and preachers have all had their say, we must return to the fact that a person participates in this society primarily as an economic entity. At rock bottom, we are neither poets, athletes, nor artists. Our existence is centered in the fact that we are consumers. Basically, we first must eat and have shelter to live, unquote. He understood that blacks had been excluded from the full economic participation, and he maintained that any strides towards civil rights had to be linked with anti-poverty programs to be effective, because the inseparable twin of racial justice was economic justice. Yet King acknowledged that the latter was a more difficult battle because it would require radical change. And we still never got to that part. They killed this man. People that came after him killed him. They didn't stop killing leaders probably until in the 70s they did. Maybe in the mid to late 80s, they just started assassinating characters in the press because they saw how powerful television, if they could just kill your image or your character to people in the press, they don't have to kill your body. Just 1 year after the historic Civil Rights Act and 2 years after the March on Washington, King was frustrated by the lack of progress. Yeah, I'm frustrated today. And by political retrenchment. In the 1965 sermon called The American Dream, he offered a more realistic sequel to the famous Dream speech. He revisited his dream metaphor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, but this time with much less publicity and fanfare, and the dream had changed. About 2 years ago, I tried to tell the nation about a dream I had. I must confess to you this morning that since that sweltering August afternoon in 1963, my dream has often turned into a nightmare. I've seen it shattered. I can continue to see it shattered as I walk through the Harlems of our nation and see sometimes 10 and 15 Negroes trying to live in 1 or 2 rooms. I've been down to the Delta of Mississippi since then, and I've seen my dreams shattered as I met hundreds of people who didn't earn more than $600 or $700 a week. I've seen my dreams shattered as I've walked the streets of Chicago and seen Negroes, young men and women, with a sense of utter hopelessness because they can't find any jobs and they see life as long and desolate corridor with no exit signs, unquote. And just like I walk out every day and I tell you all, I see black people nodding off from heroin, sleeping in parks, sleeping under trees, sleeping on the pavement, sleeping on benches in the subway. So we went from 2 or 3 people squeezing into apartments to people sleeping on the street. And New York City was handing out tents at one point to migrants, but you better believe whatever they do to them, they're going to end up doing to black people. You mark my words. And if New York changes that right to shelter law, you're going to see a lot of black people on the street. By the 1960s, black poverty was deeply entrenched, but more importantly, it was marked by its stark contrast to the white middle class's prosperity. Not only had the majority of blacks not ridden the post-war economic boom, conditions in the ghetto had actually worsened. Almost half of the black children lived in poverty, in contrast with only 9% of white children. Black families had less than 1/5 of the wealth of white families. A Federal Reserve study concluded that the source of the wealth gap was historic inequalities in income and opportunities, a legacy of past economic deprivation, which would not be fixed even if the income gap were eliminated. The study held that it could only be closed by a reversal of past privileges. The wealth and opportunity gap would continue unabated without direct government action. In other words, something more than just stopping racial discrimination. They're talking about a lot of different reparations plans, and different states and counties have already implemented some of those plans, but they're not real reparations. They're like, I know one county gave a certain amount of money for people if they were going to buy a home or renovate the home that they lived in to give it more equity. So it was tied to something. And reparations should just be, here's the money that you're owed. It shouldn't be tied to things, and you shouldn't have to fill out 50,000 pieces of paper to get it. But that's probably what they're going to try to do if they ever do reparations. But what more likely they're going to do, and this is going to be the compromise, they're going to call it the compromise. But it's just a compromise between them, not them and us. They're going to do a UBI, and maybe, if they want to even have a piece of justice, because it matters. It matters that things be just. If they want to have a piece of justice, they might give black people a little more. Or they'll do a UBI for poor people, and overwhelmingly majority of the black people are in poverty. So they'll give the poor people the UBI and everybody else, or the income, a stipend, and nobody else will get it. Or you'll get it based on your income. So you'll get a little more if you're poor, and everybody else will get another base, and that'll be a universal basic income. Everybody will get it. And that's probably what they'll do. So we'll see. Laws set in motion a century earlier had created a black ghetto economy that was uniquely ruinous. Black poverty, having been created by economic exclusion and segregation, was distinct from white poverty. The urban ghettos were zones with fewer public resources, such as quality schools, roads, hospitals, universities, and infrastructure. In fact, even the urban renewal programs that upgraded and revived America's cities in the 1960s did so at the expense of black population. James Baldwin referred to urban renewal programs as Negro removal, for the effect was the highways and roads built through the ghettos pushed and packed black residents into increasingly overcrowded and under-resourced neighborhoods. The segregated ghettos, or ghetto, contained too little capital, and its main export, labor, was struggling to find work as industries abandoned America's cities for the less costly suburbs before eventually moving offshore. And we'll pick up Sunday with some more from this chapter. And of course, it's The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap by Mercer Baradaran. And you can see her on a lot of things speaking about all kinds of topics. I'm not sure where she's teaching, but I believe she's a professor. But check her out. Check the book out. I'll see you next time. And remember, you can support by giving directly, donating. Go to patreon.com/Conderson Center, etsy.com/shop/Conderson Center. You can buy my stuff, or you can become a subscriber. Talk to you later.